The stagecoach rattled into Golden, Colorado on a blistering August afternoon in 1878, and Samuel Rutherford felt his stomach tighten with anticipation as he watched it roll to a stop in front of the general store, dust billowing around its wooden wheels like a storm cloud settling over the mountains that loomed in the distance. He had been waiting 3 months for this moment, ever since he had sent that letter east to the mail-order bride agency in Boston. And now his future wife was somewhere inside that coach, a woman he had never seen except for the small photograph she had sent that showed a face he could barely make out through the spots and blur of early photography. He stood near the hitching post with his hat in his hands, his dark hair damp with sweat despite the shade of the building's overhang, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone in the street could probably hear it. The driver climbed down and opened the door, helping out an older couple first, then a businessman with a leather satchel, and finally a woman who took the driver's hand and stepped down with practiced grace. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The woman was beautiful. There was no denying that, with rich auburn hair gathered in an elegant twist at the nape of her neck, fine cheekbones, and intelligent green eyes that swept the street with curiosity rather than fear. But she was older than he had expected, significantly older, perhaps in her late 30s or even touching 40, while he was only 28. The photograph must have been taken many years ago, or perhaps the light had been kind to her in ways that reality could not match. She spotted him almost immediately, her gaze locking onto the only man who seemed to be waiting for someone, and her expression shifted through a series of emotions too quick to read. She walked toward him with her carpet bag in hand, her traveling dress dusty from the road, but still maintaining an air of dignity that spoke of good breeding and careful habits. Samuel found himself frozen in place, unsure of what to say or do, his prepared greeting evaporating like morning dew under the hot sun. "Samuel Rutherford," she asked, her voice rich and cultured, with the crisp accent of New England that made every word sound like it belonged in a book. "Yes, madam," he managed, and then immediately wondered if calling his future wife madam was appropriate or if it made him sound like a child addressing his schoolteacher. "I am Florence Fletcher," she said, and there was a pause where neither of them seemed to know what to do next. She was studying his face carefully, and he realized she was probably trying to gauge his reaction to her age, waiting for disappointment or anger or rejection. He had heard stories of mail-order brides being turned away at the station when they did not match their descriptions, left stranded in strange towns with nowhere to go and no money to return home. He cleared his throat and found his voice, remembering his mother's teachings about kindness and grace even when life threw unexpected challenges in your path. "It is very nice to meet you, Miss Fletcher. I hope your journey was not too difficult." "It was long," she admitted, "but I have endured worse." There was something in the way she said it that suggested a deep well of experience, of trials faced and overcome, that made Samuel suddenly curious about what her life had been before this moment. He reached for her carpet bag and she let him take it, which he took as a small victory. "I have a wagon just over here. I thought we could go see Reverend Matthews today if you are not too tired, or we could wait until tomorrow if you need rest. There is a boarding house where you can stay until we are properly married." Florence looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing options, calculating possibilities. "You are disappointed," she said finally, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "I am older than you expected." Samuel felt heat rise in his face, not from embarrassment at being caught out, but from shame that his reaction had been so transparent. His mother had raised him better than that. "I will admit you are not what I expected," he said honestly, because lying seemed like a poor way to start a marriage. but I do not see how that is necessarily a bad thing." He took a breath and then spoke words that came from somewhere deep inside him, words he had not planned, but that felt true the moment they left his mouth. "Age means wisdom and grace, Miss Fletcher. My mother used to say that all the time before she passed. A woman who has lived and learned is worth 10 pretty young girls who only know how to giggle and flutter their eyelashes." Something shifted in Florence's expression, a softening around her eyes, a subtle relaxation in her shoulders. "That is very kind of you to say, Mr. Rutherford. I appreciate your honesty and your courtesy. I will confess that I, too, have not been entirely forthcoming in my correspondence. The photograph I sent was indeed taken some years ago, and I did not specify my exact age because I feared no one would respond if they knew the truth." "How old are you, if I may ask?" Samuel said, keeping his tone gentle. "I am 39 years old," Florence said, lifting her chin slightly as if daring him to make an issue of it. "I am too old to bear many children, if that is what you are hoping for in a wife. I may give you one or two if God wills it, but I cannot promise you a houseful." Samuel had grown up with 5 brothers and 3 sisters in a cabin that was always too small and too loud, and while he loved them all dearly, the idea of a quieter household did not fill him with dread. "I am not looking to populate an entire territory," he said with a slight smile. "1 or 2 children would be a blessing, or none at all if that is how things work out. I mostly just wanted a partner, someone to share the work and the life I am building here." Florence's eyebrows rose slightly, and he could see surprise and perhaps a touch of relief in her expression. "You are an unusual man, Mr. Rutherford. I will take that as a compliment," he replied. "Now, what do you say we get you out of this sun and find you something cold to drink? We can discuss the particulars of our arrangement once you have had a chance to wash the dust off and rest a bit." She nodded, and together they walked to his wagon, a sturdy vehicle with good wheels and a team of 2 brown horses that he had raised from colts. He helped her up onto the seat, noticing how she moved with a certain stiffness that suggested the journey had indeed taken its toll on her body. Once he had loaded her carpet bag in the back and climbed up beside her, he snapped the reins gently, and the horses started forward at an easy pace. Golden was not a large town, but it was growing steadily thanks to the mining operations in the surrounding mountains and the railroad that had come through 5 years earlier. Main Street was lined with wooden buildings painted in cheerful colors, their false fronts making them look taller and more impressive than they actually were. There was a general store, a bank, a saloon, a hotel with a restaurant on the ground floor, a church with a white steeple, a blacksmith shop, a doctor's office, and various other establishments that served the needs of the community. People moved along the wooden sidewalks going about their business, and several of them looked up with curiosity as Samuel drove past with an unfamiliar woman at his side. "It is a nice town," Florence said, her eyes taking in everything with the sharp observation of someone who needed to quickly learn her new environment. "Smaller than I expected, but that is not a criticism. I have lived in cities most of my life, and I found them exhausting. There is something appealing about a place where you can see the mountains from every window." "We are right up against the foothills here," Samuel explained. "My ranch is about 3 miles outside of town, up in a valley that has good grazing and a creek that runs year-round. It is not fancy, but it is mine, paid for with money I saved working as a ranch hand for other men for 10 years. I have about 200 acres, 50 head of cattle, a dozen horses, some chickens, and a good sturdy house with 4 rooms and a real wood floor." "That sounds quite impressive," Florence said, and she seemed to mean it. "What made you decide you needed a wife?" It was a fair question, one that deserved a thoughtful answer. Samuel guided the horses around a particularly deep rut in the road before responding. I suppose I got tired of coming home to an empty house every night. I can cook and clean well enough to keep myself alive, but there is a difference between surviving and actually living. I wanted someone to talk to in the evenings, someone who would care if I came home safe at the end of the day, someone to build something with instead of just building things alone. Florence was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was softer than before. That is a good reason. Better than many I have heard. What about you? Samuel asked, glancing at her profile. What made you decide to come west and marry a stranger? She took a long breath and let it out slowly. Necessity mostly, though I will admit there was also an element of hope involved. I was married before, when I was 20. My husband was a good man, a merchant in Boston with a successful business. We were happy for 11 years, and then he caught pneumonia one winter and died within a week. He left me the business, but his brothers contested the will, and I spent 3 years fighting them in court. I eventually won, but by then the business had suffered, and I had spent all my money on lawyers. I sold what was left and tried to start over, but Boston society is not kind to widows, especially widows who have shown themselves capable of fighting for what is theirs. I was seen as unfeminine, too independent, too difficult. Men my age wanted young brides who would defer to them in all things. Younger men were not interested in a woman old enough to be their mother. Samuel felt a surge of anger at the injustice of it, at the waste of a good woman's potential simply because society had arbitrary rules about what women could and could not do. Their loss is my gain, then, he said firmly. I do not need someone to defer to me. I need someone who can think for herself and speak her mind and help make decisions. Running a ranch is hard work, and there are always problems to solve. 2 heads are better than 1 when it comes to figuring things out. Florence looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, something between gratitude and disbelief, as if she could not quite trust that he meant what he said. You may change your mind once you realize how opinionated I can be. I doubt it, Samuel replied with a grin. I grew up with 3 sisters who could out-argue a lawyer and a mother who ran the household with an iron will wrapped in velvet. I am not scared of a woman with opinions. That earned him a genuine laugh, the first real expression of joy he had heard from her, and the sound of it made something warm bloom in his chest. He decided right then that he wanted to hear that laugh as often as possible, wanted to be the kind of man who could bring light to her eyes instead of weariness. They pulled up in front of the boarding house, a 2-story structure painted yellow with white trim, and a wide porch where 2 older women sat in rocking chairs watching the world go by. Samuel helped Florence down from the wagon and carried her carpet bag up the steps, nodding to the women as they passed. Inside, the proprietor was a widow named Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had come to Colorado with her husband during the gold rush and stayed after he died in a mining accident. She ran the cleanest, most respectable boarding house in town, and she had a reputation for protecting her female guests from any unwanted attention. Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Florence Fletcher, Samuel said as the small, elegant woman came out from the back room. She will be staying here until we can arrange a wedding. She needs a room with a good bed and hot water for washing. Mrs. Chen looked Florence up and down with shrewd, dark eyes that missed nothing, and then she nodded once. I have a nice room on the 2nd floor, faces east so you get morning sun but not afternoon heat. $2 a night, includes breakfast and dinner. Washing water is extra. That sounds perfect, Florence said, and Samuel noticed that she did not look to him for approval before agreeing to the terms. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a small coin purse, counting out coins with practiced efficiency. "I will take the room for 3 nights to start." "Will that give us enough time to arrange things, Mr. Rutherford?" "Should be plenty," Samuel agreed. "I will go see the Reverend today and find out when he can perform the ceremony. Tomorrow we can get you anything you might need from the general store. The day after that we can marry, and then I will bring you out to the ranch." Mrs. Chen took the money and led Florence upstairs, leaving Samuel standing in the front hall feeling slightly off balance. He had expected a timid woman who would need him to make all the decisions, but Florence was clearly used to handling her own affairs. He found he liked that about her, even though it was different from what he had imagined. He spent the rest of the afternoon making arrangements. Reverend Matthews was happy to perform the ceremony in 2 days' time, asking only that Samuel and Florence meet with him the day before for a brief counseling session. Samuel stopped by the general store and ordered a few supplies he thought Florence might appreciate, including good coffee, fresh bread, a jar of honey, and some fabric that might be made into new curtains for the ranch house. He also stopped by the small office where his friend Daniel worked as the town's unofficial newspaper publisher and lawyer, to make sure there would be a witness for the ceremony. By the time he headed back out to his ranch, the sun was lowering toward the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the rocky slopes. He felt nervous and excited and uncertain all at once, wondering if he had made the right decision, wondering if Florence would change her mind once she saw where she would be living, wondering if they could really make a marriage work when they were essentially strangers. The ranch house looked small and lonely as he approached it, a simple rectangular structure with a pitched roof and a front porch that he had built himself over the course of 2 summers. The barn was in better shape, built by the previous owner before Samuel bought the land, and the corral held most of his horses, who raised their heads to watch him arrive. He took care of his wagon team first, unhitching them and leading them to the barn, brushing them down and making sure they had feed and water. The cattle were scattered across the pasture, dark shapes in the gathering dusk, and he counted them automatically, making sure none had wandered off or fallen prey to predators. Inside the house, he lit a lamp and looked around with critical eyes, trying to see it as Florence would. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a cast iron stove in one corner, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, and shelves that held his dishes and supplies. There was a bedroom on one side with a decent bed and a chest of drawers, and another smaller room that he had been using for storage but could be converted to a second bedroom if needed. A washroom had been added onto the back, a luxury he had installed last year after getting tired of hauling water for bathing. The floors were clean, the windows had glass in them instead of just shutters, and the roof did not leak. It was not much by city standards, but it was solid and warm and his. He made himself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread left over from the day before, eating mechanically while his mind churned over everything that had happened. He kept coming back to the moment when he had first seen Florence step down from the stagecoach, to the way his heart had stuttered at her age and then steadied as he looked into her eyes and saw intelligence and strength looking back at him. Age means wisdom and grace. His mother had said that, and she had lived those words, raising 9 children and managing a household with competence and love until the day a fever took her 5 years ago. If Florence had even half his mother's capability and warmth, they would do just fine together. He slept poorly that night, tossing and turning as his mind refused to settle, and he was up before dawn to do his morning chores. The cattle needed to be checked, the horses needed tending, the chickens needed feeding, and there was a fence section in the north pasture that needed repair before winter. He worked steadily through the morning, and by the time he cleaned up and headed back into town, it was nearly noon. He found Florence sitting in the boarding house parlor with a book in her lap, looking much more rested than she had the day before. She was wearing a different dress, this one a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and her hair was arranged in a simpler style that was more practical for the Western climate. She looked up when he entered and gave him a small smile. "Good morning, Mr. Rutherford." "Or should I say good afternoon, Samuel, please," he said, taking off his hat. "Mr. Rutherford makes me feel like I should be wearing a suit and sitting in a bank." "Samuel, then," she agreed. "And you must call me Florence. We are going to be married in 2 days, after all." It seems silly to stand on formality. "Florence," he repeated, liking the way her name felt in his mouth. "Are you ready to do some shopping? I thought we could go to the general store and you could pick out anything you need or want for the house. I also need to introduce you to a few people around town so you do not feel like a complete stranger when you are here without me." She set down her book and stood, smoothing her skirts. "That sounds like a good plan. I must confess I am curious to see what kind of supplies are available here. I imagine it is quite different from what I am used to in Boston." They walked to the general store together, and Samuel was acutely aware of the curious looks they received from people on the street. Small towns were like that, everyone knowing everyone else's business, and the arrival of a mail-order bride was news that would spread quickly. He nodded to the people he knew, offering brief introductions when appropriate, and Florence handled each meeting with polished grace that suggested years of social training. The general store was owned by a couple named the Hendersons, who had been in Golden since before the town had a proper name. Mrs. Henderson was a plump, cheerful woman with iron-gray hair and a tendency to gossip, but she ran a good store with fair prices and a wide selection of goods. She looked up from behind the counter when Samuel and Florence entered, her eyes widening with interest. "Samuel Rutherford, is this the bride you have been waiting for?" she asked, not bothering with subtlety. "It is," Samuel confirmed. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Florence Fletcher from Boston. Florence, this is Mrs. Henderson, who can find you anything you need and probably several things you did not know you needed until she tells you about them." Mrs. Henderson laughed and came around the counter to shake Florence's hand. "He is not wrong about that. Welcome to Golden, dear. You let me know if you need anything at all. We do not get many refined ladies out here, and it will be nice to have someone new to talk to." Florence smiled, but Samuel noticed it did not quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I am sure I will be visiting often once I am settled." They spent the next hour going through the store, with Florence selecting practical items like fabric for dish towels, thread for mending, candles, soap, and various food staples. She had a good eye for quality and was not shy about examining items carefully before deciding whether to purchase them. Samuel added his own selections to the growing pile, including a new cast iron skillet to replace the one he had accidentally cracked last month, a tin of baking powder, and a sack of sugar. "You have expensive tastes," Florence observed as Samuel paid for everything, watching Mrs. Henderson tally up the total. "I believe in buying good things that will last," Samuel replied. "Cheap tools break, cheap fabric tears, cheap food tastes like sawdust. Life is hard enough without making it harder by surrounding yourself with inferior goods." "A philosophy I can appreciate," Florence said. "My husband felt the same way. He used to say that a man who buys cheap buys twice." It was the first time she had mentioned her late husband without being prompted, and Samuel took it as a sign that she was beginning to feel more comfortable with him. They carried their purchases back to the wagon, And then Samuel suggested they get lunch at the hotel restaurant. Florence agreed, and they settled into a corner table where they could talk without being overheard. The food was simple but well prepared: roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread with butter, and apple pie for dessert. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Florence set down her fork and looked at Samuel seriously. "I think we should discuss expectations before we marry," she said. "I do not want there to be any misunderstandings about what kind of marriage this will be." Samuel nodded, appreciating her directness. "That seems wise. What are your concerns?" "First, I need to know if you expect this to be a true marriage in all senses, or if you are looking for more of a housekeeper who happens to share your name," Florence said, her cheeks coloring slightly but her gaze remaining steady. "I will be honest with you, Samuel. I loved my first husband very much, and I do not know if I can love another man the way I loved him. But I am willing to try to build something real with you if that is what you want. If, however, you only want practical help around your ranch and do not care about emotional intimacy, I can accept that as well. I just need to know what you are expecting." Samuel took a drink of water, gathering his thoughts. "I want a real marriage," he said finally. "I want someone I can talk to and laugh with and maybe eventually love, even if that love looks different from what you had before. I am not expecting you to forget your first husband or to pretend he never existed. But I am hoping that over time we can build our own connection, something that belongs just to us. As for the physical side of marriage, I will not force anything. We can take our time with that, get to know each other first, and let things develop naturally." Relief washed over Florence's face so clearly that Samuel realized she had been genuinely worried about his answer. "Thank you for being honest. I was afraid you might want something I could not give." "I want a partner," Samuel said simply. "Everything else will follow if we treat each other with respect and kindness." They finished their lunch talking about more practical matters, like what time she should be ready on their wedding day and what she should pack for the move to the ranch. Samuel found himself relaxing into the conversation, discovering that Florence was well-read and curious about the world, with opinions on everything from politics to poetry. She asked intelligent questions about his ranch and his plans for expanding it, and she offered suggestions based on things she had learned helping her husband run his business. The next day they met with Reverend Matthews, a kindly man in his 60s who had been married to his own wife for 40 years and had strong opinions about what made a marriage work. He talked to them about communication and compromise, about the importance of prayer and shared values, about weathering storms together rather than turning on each other when times got hard. Samuel and Florence both listened attentively, and when the Reverend asked if they had any questions, Florence surprised Samuel by asking about the legal aspects of marriage in Colorado territory. "I want to make sure I understand what rights I will have as a married woman here," she explained. "In Massachusetts, I learned the hard way that a widow's rights are not always respected. I want to know what protections exist if something happens to Samuel." Reverend Matthews looked taken aback by the blunt question, but he recovered quickly. "Colorado has actually been quite progressive in that regard. We granted women the right to vote in school board elections a few years back, and the property laws are more favorable to wives than in many eastern states. You should speak with Daniel Morris, our local lawyer, to get specific legal advice. But in general, you would have rights to Samuel's property and assets as his legal wife." After the meeting, Samuel took Florence to meet Daniel, who was happy to explain the intricacies of Colorado property law, and even offered to draw up a simple will for Samuel that would ensure Florence was protected. Florence seemed satisfied with the information, and Samuel found himself impressed by her practical approach to what most people would consider unromantic topics. "You think I am cold and calculating," Florence said as they walked back toward the boarding house, correctly interpreting his expression. "Not at all," Samuel replied honestly. "I think you are smart and careful, and I respect that. You have been through a lot, and it makes sense that you would want to protect yourself. I am not offended. Many men would be," Florence said quietly. "They would see it as a lack of trust or faith." "Then many men are fools," Samuel said bluntly. "Trust is earned over time, not demanded from the start. And faith is fine for matters of the spirit, but practical concerns require practical planning." Florence stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes searching his face. "You are not what I expected either, Samuel Rutherford. When I answered your advertisement, I thought I would be marrying a simple cowboy who needed someone to cook and clean and keep him warm at night. But you are more than that." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Samuel asked, suddenly nervous. "It is a very good thing," Florence said, and this time when she smiled, it reached her eyes. The wedding took place on a bright Saturday morning with the mountains standing like silent witnesses in the distance. Florence wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool that she had brought with her from Boston, with her auburn hair arranged in an elegant twist, and a small spray of wildflowers that Mrs. Chen had picked from her garden. Samuel wore his best suit, brushed and pressed, his dark hair neatly combed, his hands scrubbed clean of the ranch work that usually stained them. The ceremony was held in the small white church, with Reverend Matthews presiding and Daniel Morris standing as witness along with Mrs. Henderson and a handful of other townspeople who had come out of curiosity or genuine goodwill. Samuel spoke his vows clearly and meant every word, promising to honor and cherish Florence for as long as they both lived. Florence's voice was steady as she made her own promises, her hand warm in his. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife and told Samuel he could kiss his bride, Samuel leaned in carefully and pressed a gentle kiss to Florence's lips, brief and chaste but genuine. Her eyes widened slightly, and then she returned the kiss with equal gentleness. They signed the marriage certificate, making everything legal and official, and then accepted congratulations from the small crowd. Mrs. Henderson hugged Florence and pressed a wrapped package into her hands, declaring it a wedding gift that should not be opened until later. Daniel shook Samuel's hand and clapped him on the shoulder, wishing them both happiness. Even Mrs. Chen had come, bringing a beautiful embroidered silk scarf for Florence that she said had belonged to her own mother in China. Afterward, they loaded Florence's belongings into the wagon and set out for the ranch. It was a beautiful day for a drive, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers from the mountains. The road wound through rolling foothills, following the creek that would supply their water, passing through stands of aspen and pine that rustled in the wind. Samuel pointed out landmarks as they went, showing Florence the boundaries of his property, the best fishing spots in the creek, the place where he had once seen a black bear with 2 cubs. Florence took it all in with obvious interest, asking questions about the land and the weather and what challenges he faced as a rancher. She told him about Boston, about the busy streets and crowded buildings, about the ocean that she could sometimes smell on the wind when she walked near the harbor. She described her life there with neither excessive nostalgia nor bitterness, simply as a chapter that had closed so a new one could begin. The ranch house came into view as they rounded the final bend, and Samuel felt his stomach tighten with nervousness. He had done his best to clean and prepare, but he knew it was modest compared to what Florence must be accustomed to. She was quiet as they approached, her eyes taking in the house, the barn, the corrals, the mountains rising behind it all. "What do you think?" Samuel asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. "I think it is beautiful," Florence said softly. "I think it looks like a place where a person could build a real life." Relief flooded through him as he helped her down from the wagon. He carried her bags inside and showed her around, pointing out the bedroom that would be theirs, the storage room that could be converted to other uses, the kitchen area with its good stove, and the table he had built himself. Florence walked through slowly, running her hands over surfaces, looking out windows, nodding to herself as if making mental plans. "The windows need curtains," she said finally. "And we should get some rugs for the floors to keep the warmth in during winter. But overall, Samuel, you have made a good home here. I can work with this." They spent the rest of the day settling Florence in, finding places for her belongings, rearranging furniture to suit her preferences. Samuel was surprised at how easy it was to work alongside her, how naturally they seemed to fall into a rhythm of cooperation. When evening came, Florence insisted on cooking dinner, shooing Samuel out of the kitchen area while she worked. He sat in the rocking chair and watched her move around the space, learning where things were kept, humming softly to herself as she prepared food. The domesticity of it made something ache in his chest, a longing he had not fully acknowledged until this moment. Dinner was simple but delicious, better than anything Samuel had cooked for himself in months. They ate at the table as the sun set outside the windows, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Afterward, there was an awkward moment when they both realized it was time for bed and they would be sharing a room for the first time. Samuel saw the tension in Florence's shoulders and made a quick decision. "I can sleep in the storage room tonight if you would prefer," he offered. "Give you time to get used to the place without feeling crowded." Florence looked at him for a long moment and then she shook her head. "We are married, Samuel. We should share a bed like married people do. I am just a bit nervous, that is all." "It has been a long time since I shared a bed with anyone." "We do not have to do anything," Samuel said quickly. "We can just sleep. Get used to each other's presence." "I would like that," Florence said, and the gratitude in her voice made Samuel glad he had suggested it. They prepared for bed in shy silence, taking turns in the washroom, changing into nightclothes with their backs turned to give each other privacy. The bed was large enough that they could lie side by side without touching, though Samuel was acutely aware of Florence's presence beside him, the soft sound of her breathing, the warmth radiating from her body. He stared at the ceiling in the darkness and wondered if she was as awake as he was. "Samuel," her voice came quietly through the dark. "Yes. Thank you for being patient with me and for being kind. I know I am not the young bride you probably imagined when you sent for a wife." He rolled onto his side to face her, though he could barely make out her shape in the darkness. "I already told you, age means wisdom and grace. I meant that, Florence. I am glad you are who you are." She was quiet for a moment, and then he felt her hand reach out and find his, her fingers threading through his own. They fell asleep like that, holding hands in the darkness, two people beginning to build a bridge between their separate lives. The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt surprisingly natural. Samuel woke before dawn to tend to the animals and check the cattle, while Florence prepared breakfast and began the endless round of household tasks that kept a home running. She was a hard worker, he discovered, not afraid of difficult chores or long hours. She could churn butter, preserve vegetables, mend clothes, and do 100 other things with the easy competence of someone who had been managing a household for decades. But she also brought touches of refinement that the ranch house had never known before. Curtains made from the fabric Samuel had bought, wildflowers in a jar on the table, books arranged on a shelf he built at her request. They talked while they worked, sharing stories about their pasts, their families, their hopes for the future. Samuel learned that Florence had wanted children desperately, but had never been able to conceive during her first marriage, that it was a grief she had carried silently for years. Florence learned that Samuel's father had died when he was 12, leaving him as the oldest son to help support the family, that he had worked himself nearly into the ground before finally saving enough to buy his own land. They discovered shared interests in books and music, though Florence's knowledge was far more extensive than Samuel's limited education had provided. She began teaching him things in the evenings, reading aloud from her books, explaining ideas and concepts that opened up whole new worlds for him. In the quiet dark of their bedroom, they grew gradually more comfortable with each other's physical presence. Samuel never pushed for more than Florence was ready to give, content to simply hold her as they slept, to occasionally press a kiss to her forehead or temple. But one night, about 3 weeks after their wedding, Florence rolled toward him instead of away, and when he opened his arms, she moved into his embrace fully, tucking her head under his chin. "I feel safe with you," she whispered. "I did not expect that." Samuel tightened his arms around her, feeling the softness of her body against his, breathing in the scent of her hair. "You are safe with me," he promised. "Always." That night they made love for the first time, slowly and carefully, learning each other's bodies with gentle hands and whispered encouragements. It was not the passionate frenzy of youth, but something deeper and more meaningful, an act of trust and growing affection. Afterward, Florence cried quietly against Samuel's chest, and he held her and stroked her hair and did not ask what the tears meant, understanding that they were complicated things born of relief and grief and hope all tangled together. Autumn came to the mountains with a wash of gold and red as the aspen trees changed color. Samuel worked long days preparing for winter, cutting firewood, repairing the barn roof, bringing the cattle down from the high pastures. Florence helped where she could and managed the house with increasing confidence, turning it into a real home with her care and attention. They made a trip into town every few weeks for supplies, and Samuel noticed that Florence was beginning to make friends among the other women, particularly Mrs. Chen, and a younger woman named Rachel who ran the town's small school. It was Rachel who first brought up the idea of Florence teaching some classes. She stopped by the ranch one afternoon in early October with a basket of apples from her tree, ostensibly as a neighborly gift, but really to ask a favor. "I have been overwhelmed this year," Rachel confessed over coffee at Florence's kitchen table. "I have nearly 30 students ranging from age 5 to 15, all in one room, and I am expected to teach them everything from basic letters to advanced mathematics. I cannot do it alone anymore. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that you were educated back east and that you had helped run your husband's business. I know it is a lot to ask, but would you consider helping me a few days a week? I could pay a small stipend from the school fund." Florence looked surprised but interested. "What would you need me to do?" "Anything," Rachel said fervently. "Teach reading to the younger children while I work with the older ones on mathematics, help with writing lessons, share your knowledge of history and literature. I am desperate, Florence. The children are suffering because I cannot give them enough individual attention." Samuel watched Florence's face light up with an enthusiasm he had not seen before. "I would love to help," she said. "I have missed using my mind for more than just household management, if I am being honest." "When would you need me to start?" They worked out an arrangement where Florence would go into town 3 mornings a week to help at the school. Samuel supported the idea wholeheartedly, seeing how much joy it brought to his wife to be useful in this way. He rearranged his own schedule so he could drive her into town on those mornings and pick her up in the afternoon. And on the days when weather or work made that impossible, Florence proved herself perfectly capable of handling the wagon and horses on her own. The children loved her immediately. She had a gift for explaining complex ideas in ways that made sense to young minds, and she was patient with those who struggled while challenging those who excelled. She introduced the students to poetry and literature they would never have encountered otherwise, reading aloud from her precious books that she had brought from Boston. She taught them about history beyond what was in their basic textbooks, about science and art and philosophy. The parents began commenting on how much their children were learning, and soon there was talk of expanding the school and hiring Florence as an official assistant teacher. Winter arrived with heavy snows that blanketed the valley and made travel difficult. Samuel and Florence settled into a cozy routine, spending long evenings by the fire while the wind howled outside. They played card games and chess, which Florence taught Samuel with amused patience. They read together, taking turns choosing books from Florence's collection. They talked about everything and nothing, building the deep familiarity that only comes from spending real time together without distraction. One night in late January, as they lay in bed listening to snow patter against the windows, Florence took Samuel's hand and placed it on her stomach. He looked at her questioningly in the firelight that flickered through from the main room. "I am pregnant," she said, her voice full of wonder and fear. "I know I said it might not happen, that I was probably too old, but I have missed my courses twice now and I have been sick in the mornings. I went to see the doctor in town last week when you were working on that fence repair. He confirmed it." Samuel felt like his heart might burst from his chest. "Florence, that is wonderful. Are you happy about it? Are you scared?" "Both," she admitted. "I am 40 years old, Samuel. This pregnancy will be harder on me than it would be on a younger woman, and there are risks. But I also feel blessed beyond measure. I had given up hope of ever being a mother. Now I have been given this unexpected gift, and I am determined to do everything I can to bring this baby safely into the world." Samuel pulled her close and kissed her deeply, tasting salt and realizing she was crying. "We will get through this together," he promised. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes, I will make sure you and the baby are cared for." The pregnancy was indeed difficult. Florence suffered terrible morning sickness that sometimes lasted all day, and she tired easily as her body changed to accommodate the growing child. Samuel took over more of the household tasks, learning to cook edible meals and keep the house clean even if his methods were not as refined as Florence's. He was endlessly patient with her mood swings and worries, holding her when she cried about the unfairness of being sick when she should be joyful, assuring her that she was beautiful even when she felt ungainly and swollen. Mrs. Chen and Rachel became frequent visitors, bringing food and company and practical advice. The doctor made regular trips out to the ranch to check on Florence's progress, and while he was cautiously optimistic, he also warned them that older mothers faced greater dangers in childbirth. Samuel tried not to let his fear show, tried to be strong for Florence, but at night when she was asleep, he sometimes lay awake praying to a God he usually ignored, begging for her safety and the baby's health. Spring came slowly to the mountains that year, the snow reluctant to release its hold on the land. By the time the wildflowers began to bloom in the high meadows, Florence was heavily pregnant and uncomfortable, but still stubbornly insisting on helping with light chores around the house. Samuel watched her like a hawk, ready to swoop in and take over the moment she showed any sign of overtaxing herself. The baby came on a warm June night with a full moon hanging overhead and coyotes singing in the distance. Florence's labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours that felt like 20 years to Samuel. Rachel stayed with them, having some experience with childbirth from helping her own mother with younger siblings, and the doctor arrived by mid-morning to supervise. Samuel held Florence's hand and let her squeeze until his bones ached, whispering encouragements and promises, praying harder than he had ever prayed in his life. When the baby finally came with a sharp wail that filled the room, Samuel felt tears streaming down his face. The doctor wrapped the tiny infant in a clean cloth and handed the bundle to Florence, whose face was gray with exhaustion but glowing with triumph. "You have a son," the doctor said with a smile. "A healthy, strong son with good lungs." Florence cradled the baby against her chest, tears of joy and relief pouring down her cheeks. "A son," she whispered. "Oh, Samuel, we have a son." Samuel leaned in to look at the tiny red face, the miniature fingers that were already grasping reflexively, the shock of dark hair on the small head. He had never seen anything more beautiful or terrifying in his entire life. "He is perfect," he managed, his voice breaking. "You did so well, Florence. I am so proud of you." They named the baby Stephen after Samuel's father, and he became the center of their world. Florence recovered slowly from the difficult birth, but with Samuel's devoted care and the help of their friends, she regained her strength over the following weeks. Stephen was a good baby, quick to smile and relatively easy to soothe, and watching Florence with him made Samuel fall in love with his wife all over again, deeper than before, if that was even possible. As Stephen grew from an infant to a chubby toddler and then a curious little boy, the ranch prospered under Samuel and Florence's joint management. Florence's business sense helped Samuel make smart decisions about when to sell cattle and what improvements to invest in. They expanded their herd, built a better barn, and added another room onto the house. Florence continued teaching at the school a few days a week once Stephen was old enough, bringing him along to play with the other young children while she worked with the older students. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Stephen was joined by a daughter when Florence was 43, a birth that was easier than the first and produced a tiny girl with her mother's red hair and green eyes. They named her Sarah, and she grew into a spirited child who could ride a horse before she could walk properly, and who followed her father around the ranch like a devoted shadow. Samuel and Florence's love deepened into something that felt like bedrock, unshakable and essential. They had their disagreements, of course. Two strong-willed people with different backgrounds and ideas could not always agree on everything. But they had learned how to argue fairly and compromise gracefully, how to apologize when wrong and forgive when hurt. They still held hands when they walked, still stole kisses when the children were not looking, still found ways to surprise each other with small acts of kindness and affection. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel took Florence back to the exact spot where he had first met her at the stagecoach stop in Golden. The town had grown considerably, with new buildings and more people, but the general store where the coach had stopped still stood in the same place. "Do you remember standing right here and thinking I was too old?" Florence asked with amusement, leaning against Samuel's side. "I remember thinking you were not what I expected," Samuel corrected, "and then thinking that maybe unexpected was exactly what I needed." "I was right about that, by the way. You are the best unexpected thing that ever happened to me." Florence turned in his arms and kissed him, not caring that they were standing in the middle of the street where anyone could see. "Age means wisdom and grace," she quoted back at him. "You said that to me the first day we met, and I did not really believe you meant it. But you have shown me every day since that you did. You made me feel valued and loved and appreciated in ways I never expected to feel again. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose." "You gave me everything, Samuel." "We gave it to each other," Samuel said, resting his forehead against hers. "That is what partners do." They stood there together as people moved around them. Two people who had found each other across distance and difference, who had chosen to build something beautiful from uncertain beginnings. The mountains rose behind them, eternal and unchanging, witnesses to all the small human dramas that played out in their shadows. Samuel thought about the young man he had been 10 years ago, lonely and uncertain, waiting nervously for a stranger who would become his whole world. He thought about the long journey that had brought them both to this place, all the pain and loss they had survived before finding each other. "Come on," Florence said finally, taking his hand. "The children are with Mrs. Chen, which means we have the whole afternoon to ourselves. Let us go home." Home. The word carried so much weight now, so much meaning. It was not just a building or a piece of land. It was what they had created together through love and work and commitment. It was the life they shared, the family they had built, the future they were making with every choice and every day. They climbed into the wagon and headed back toward the ranch, toward the house that Florence had transformed with her care, toward the children who were waiting for them, toward all the ordinary moments that made up an extraordinary life. The road wound through the foothills with the late afternoon sun turning everything golden, and Samuel thought that he had never been happier or more content than he was in this moment, traveling this familiar path with the woman he loved by his side. Years continued to pass with the reliable change of seasons. Stephen grew tall and strong, inheriting his father's work ethic and his mother's sharp mind. He loved the ranch and took to the work naturally, riding alongside Samuel to check the herds, learning how to fix fences and deliver calves and read the weather in the mountains. Sarah remained spirited and independent, announcing at age 12 that she wanted to be a doctor like the man who had delivered her, and neither Samuel nor Florence tried to talk her out of it, despite the raised eyebrows from more traditional neighbors. Florence became a fixture at the school, eventually taking over as head teacher when Rachel married and moved to Denver. She introduced innovations that drew attention from the Territorial Education Board, and she was invited to speak at conferences about teaching methods in rural communities. Samuel was fiercely proud of her accomplishments, bragging about his brilliant wife to anyone who would listen. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the most respected operations in the region. Samuel hired a few hands to help with the work as the herd grew larger, and Florence managed the books and correspondence with the same skill she had once applied to her first husband's merchant business. They became pillars of the community, the kind of people others came to for advice or help, known for their generosity and fairness. When Samuel turned 50 and Florence 61, they hosted a party at the ranch that drew friends from all over the territory. The house and barn were decorated with lanterns and flowers. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by guests, and music from a fiddle player drifted across the valley as people danced in the yard. Stephen, now a serious young man of 22, brought a girl he had been courting, a sweet-faced daughter of a neighboring rancher who looked at him with obvious affection. Sarah, 19 and home from her first year at medical college in Denver, held court near the dessert table, regaling listeners with stories about her studies and the exciting changes happening in modern medicine. Samuel stood with his arm around Florence's waist, watching their children and friends enjoy the celebration, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction with the life they had built. Florence leaned her head against his shoulder, her red hair now heavily streaked with gray but her eyes as bright and intelligent as ever. "We have done well," she said softly. "Look at what we created from that uncertain beginning." "You were worth waiting for," Samuel replied. worth every minute of nervousness and doubt. I would choose you again and again, Florence, every time in every life." She tilted her face up to his and he kissed her, tasting 30 years of shared meals and laughter and tears and joy. Around them, their friends cheered and their children groaned in good-natured embarrassment. But Samuel and Florence ignored them all, lost in their own private moment of connection. The party continued late into the night, and when the last guest had finally departed and the children had gone to bed in their old rooms, Samuel and Florence stood on their porch watching the moon rise over the mountains. The air was cool and crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. "You ever miss Boston?" Samuel asked, a question that had occurred to him occasionally over the years but that he had never voiced. Florence considered it carefully, as she considered most things. "I miss certain things about it," she said finally. "The theater, the concerts, the libraries, the ocean. But no, I do not miss the life I had there. This is my home now, Samuel. These mountains, this ranch, this life with you. I chose it and it chose me, and I have never regretted that choice for a single moment. Not even during the hard times," Samuel pressed. "During the difficult pregnancy, or the years when money was tight, or the winters when we were snowed in for weeks." "Especially not during the hard times," Florence said firmly. "Those are the moments that showed me what we were truly made of, what our marriage was really built on. Anyone can be happy when things are easy. It takes something special to weather the storms together and come out stronger on the other side. We have that, Samuel. We have always had that." Samuel pulled her closer, grateful beyond words for the truth of what she said. They had indeed weathered storms together, both literal and metaphorical. There had been drought years when the cattle suffered, and money grew tight. There had been illness and injury, including a broken leg Samuel sustained when a horse threw him, leaving him dependent on Florence's care for months. There had been the year when Sarah nearly died from pneumonia, and they had taken turns sitting up with her night after night until the fever finally broke. There had been disagreements about how to discipline the children, about whether to expand the ranch or stay small, about 100 other things that married people argued about, but through it all, they had chosen each other again and again. They had learned to listen even when they disagreed, to apologize even when they thought they were right, to forgive even when they were hurt. They had built something that could bend without breaking, something that grew stronger with each passing year rather than wearing thin. Stephen married his sweetheart the following spring in a ceremony held at the ranch, with Reverend Matthews presiding just as he had for Samuel and Florence all those years ago. The old Reverend was in his 80s now and moved slowly, but his voice was still strong as he spoke about love and commitment and the sanctity of marriage. Samuel stood beside his son with pride bursting in his chest, while Florence cried happy tears beside the bride's mother. After the ceremony, as the party was in full swing, Stephen pulled his parents aside for a private moment. "Thank you," he said simply, looking between them, "for showing me what a good marriage looks like. For teaching me that love is about more than just feeling good, that it is about work and choice and commitment. I would not know how to be a good husband if I had not watched you two all these years." Florence hugged her son fiercely, and Samuel had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "You make us proud," he managed finally. "Now go dance with your bride before she thinks you have abandoned her." Stephen laughed and obeyed, leaving Samuel and Florence standing together near the edge of the celebration. They watched the young couple dance, so full of hope and joy and the innocent belief that love alone could conquer anything. Samuel remembered being that young, that certain, that naive. He did not regret the wisdom that age and experience had brought, but sometimes he missed the simplicity of those early days before life had complicated everything. "They will be fine," Florence said, reading his thoughts as she so often did. "They have each other and they have our example to guide them. That is more than many young couples start with." "We were lucky," Samuel said, "to find each other to make it work despite all the ways it could have failed." "It was not just luck," Florence countered. "It was choice. Every day, we chose to stay and fight and build together rather than giving up when things got hard. That is what made the difference." She was right, of course. She usually was. Samuel took her hand and led her onto the dance floor, joining the other couples who were swirling and laughing under the lantern light. They moved together with the ease of long practice, their steps perfectly matched, their bodies knowing instinctively how to move in harmony. This was what 3 decades of partnership looked like, Samuel thought. Not the passionate intensity of new love, but something deeper and more enduring, something that could weather any storm and emerge intact on the other side. Sarah left for medical college again that fall, determined to become the best doctor she could be. She wrote long letters home describing her studies and the fascinating cases she observed, and both Samuel and Florence wrote back with encouragement and love. They missed her presence at the ranch, her bright chatter and strong opinions and infectious laughter, but they were proud beyond measure of her determination to forge her own path. With both children grown and gone, Samuel and Florence found themselves alone together for the first time in years. The house felt too quiet sometimes, too empty without the noise and chaos of young people. But there was also a certain sweetness to it, a return to the early days of their marriage when it had been just the two of them learning to be together. They took long walks in the evenings, exploring parts of their property they had not visited in years. They sat together reading by the fire, not needing to fill the silence with constant conversation. They made love with the unhurried passion of people who knew each other's bodies as well as their own, finding new depths of intimacy as the demands of parenthood faded. One evening in late autumn, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, Florence spoke into the comfortable silence. "I need to tell you something," she said, her tone serious enough to make Samuel turn to look at her with concern. "What is it?" "Are you unwell?" "No, nothing like that," she assured him. "I just realized today that I am happier now than I have ever been in my entire life. Even happier than when the children were small, even happier than in the early days with James. And I wanted you to know that, Samuel. I wanted you to understand what a gift you have given me." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You have given me the same gift, Florence. You took a lonely cowboy with an empty house and gave him a home, a family, a purpose beyond just surviving. You taught me what love really means. Not the fairy tale version, but the real thing that lasts and grows and changes over time. I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Florence reached over and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. They sat like that, as the sun sank below the mountains and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from uncertain beginnings. The years continued their steady march. Stephen and his wife had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who visited the ranch often and adored their grandparents. Sarah graduated from medical college and opened a practice in Golden, becoming the town's first female doctor and shocking the more conservative residents with her competence and confidence. She remained unmarried, declaring that she had no interest in being a wife when she could be a doctor instead. And while some people clucked their tongues at this, Samuel and Florence supported her completely. Samuel's hair went completely white, and his body began to show the wear of decades of hard physical labor, aches and pains becoming constant companions. Florence moved more slowly than she once had, her joints stiff on cold mornings, her eyesight requiring spectacles for reading. But they were healthy for their age, still active and engaged with life, still partners in every sense of the word. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Stephen and his family came, as did Sarah with several of her doctor friends from Denver. Mrs. Chen was there, impossibly ancient but still sharp as a tack. The current teacher at the school came to pay respects to Florence, who was now considered a legend in territorial education circles. Daniel Morris came with his own grandchildren, reminiscing about the day he had witnessed Samuel and Florence's wedding. As Samuel looked around at all the people who had come to celebrate their marriage, he was struck by how much life had grown from that one uncertain decision to send for a mail-order bride. All these people, these children and grandchildren and friends, existed in some way because he and Florence had chosen to take a chance on each other. It was humbling and awe-inspiring at the same time. That night, after everyone had left or gone to bed, Samuel and Florence lay together in their familiar bed, the same one they had shared for 40 years. The house creaked and settled around them, as comfortable and well-worn as an old coat. Florence's head rested on Samuel's shoulder, her hand over his heart, feeling the steady beat that had become the rhythm of her life. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Florence asked softly. "When you saw that I was older than you expected." "Age means wisdom and grace," Samuel quoted. "I meant it then, and I mean it even more now. Every year with you has been a gift, Florence, every single one." "We grew old together," Florence said with satisfaction. "Not everyone gets that privilege. Some marriages end too soon, taken by death or divorce or simple indifference. But we made it. We went the distance." "We did," Samuel agreed, "and I would do it all again without changing a single thing." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had become one through decades of shared life, who had proven that love was not just a feeling, but a choice made new every single day. Outside, the mountains stood eternal under a canopy of stars, and somewhere in the darkness, the creek that ran through their property sang its endless song, the same song it had been singing since long before they arrived and that would continue long after they were gone. Years passed, as years do. Samuel and Florence celebrated their 50th anniversary with a smaller gathering, just family and close friends, both of them moving slowly now but still sharp in mind and devoted to each other. Stephen took over most of the ranch operations, though Samuel still insisted on helping with light tasks, unable to fully retire from the work that had defined so much of his life. Florence still read voraciously and kept up correspondence with educators across the country, her mind as active as ever even as her body grew frail. On a cold winter morning in 1929, Samuel woke to find Florence lying peacefully beside him, her hand still in his, but her breathing stilled. She had died in her sleep at the age of 90, her heart simply stopping after 9 decades of beating faithfully. Samuel held her for a long time, tears streaming down his weathered face, grateful that she had gone peacefully and without pain, devastated that the great adventure they had shared for 51 years had finally come to its inevitable end. The funeral was one of the largest Golden had ever seen, with people coming from all over the territory to pay their respects to a woman who had touched so many lives. Samuel listened to the stories people told about Florence, about students she had taught who went on to great things, about people she had helped when they were struggling, about the quiet generosity and kindness that had characterized her life. He realized that while he had known her better than anyone, he had still only known one facet of the remarkable woman she had been. After the funeral, after the guests had gone, and the family had returned to their own homes, Samuel sat alone in the ranch house that suddenly felt too big and too empty. He looked around at all the traces of Florence's presence, the curtains she had sewn, the books she had loved, the small touches that had transformed a bachelor's cabin into a real home. The grief was enormous, a physical weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. But along with the grief was gratitude, a bone-deep thankfulness for every moment they had shared. He thought about the nervous young man who had stood at the stagecoach, stopped waiting for a bride he had never met, afraid she would not be what he hoped for. He thought about Florence stepping down from that coach, older and more worldly than he had expected, her eyes full of uncertainty and hope. He thought about how he had found the words that had opened the door to everything that followed. Age means wisdom and grace. Those words had proven prophetic in ways he could never have imagined. Florence had brought wisdom to his life, teaching him about literature and ideas, and ways of thinking he would never have discovered on his own. She had brought grace, transforming his simple existence into something richer and more meaningful. She had been his partner in the truest sense, sharing the work and the joy and the sorrow of building a life together. Samuel lived for 3 more years after Florence's death, years that felt both endless and fleeting. He spent his time with his grandchildren, passing on the stories and values that Florence had helped him shape. He sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sun set over the mountains, feeling Florence's presence in the wind and the birds' song and the endless sky. He kept her books on their shelf and her favorite chair by the fireplace, finding comfort in the physical reminders of her existence. When his own time came, on a spring morning bright with wildflowers and new growth, Samuel went peacefully in his sleep, just as Florence had. He was 91 years old, and he had lived a good life, a full life, a life made immeasurably richer by the woman who had taken a chance on a lonely cowboy with an advertisement for a wife. They buried him beside Florence in the small cemetery outside Golden, under a headstone that bore both their names and a simple inscription: "Partners in life and love, together forever." The mountains rose behind the cemetery, eternal and beautiful, watching over the mortal remains of 2 people who had proven that love could indeed last a lifetime if you chose it every single day, if you valued wisdom and grace over youth and perfection, if you built something real and lasting on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. Stephen and Sarah stood together at their parents' graves, their own children and grandchildren gathered around them, representing the legacy that Samuel and Florence had created. The family they had built continued, carrying forward the values and love that had defined their marriage. In the end, that was the real measure of a life well lived. Not wealth or fame, but the love that persisted, the connections that endured, the way one brave choice rippled outward to touch generations yet unborn. The mail-order bride had been older than expected, but the cowboy had been wise enough to see that age meant wisdom and grace. And in that recognition, in that moment of choosing to look deeper than surface appearances, 2 lonely people had found everything they had been searching for and more than they had ever dared to hope for. They had found home in each other, and that home had lasted until death parted them. And even then, the love they had shared continued to echo through the lives they had touched and the family they had created. The wind whispered through the cemetery, rustling the wildflowers that grew around the headstone, carrying with it the eternal song of the mountains and the creek and the land itself. And if one listened carefully, they might hear something else in that wind, the sound of laughter, of quiet conversations on a porch at sunset, of two voices raised in harmony, forever joined in the great mystery of love that transcends time and age and all the small concerns that seem so important until you find the one person who makes everything else fade into insignificance. Samuel and Florence's story became legend in Golden, told and retold over the years, changing in small details but always maintaining the essential truth at its core. That real love is not about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone perfectly suited to you, someone who challenges and complements and completes you in ways you did not even know you needed. Their story reminded people that it was never too late to start over, never too late to take a chance, never too late to open your heart to possibility. And in the ranch house that had been their home, where Stephen's family now lived, traces of Samuel and Florence could still be felt in every room. The books on the shelf, the rocking chair by the fireplace, the way the evening light fell through the windows onto the wooden floor. The house remembered them, held their memory in its walls and rafters, kept their love alive in the very structure of its being. And that was how it should be, because some loves are too powerful to ever truly fade, too foundational to ever be forgotten, too real to ever become mere history. They had been two strangers who became partners, who became lovers, who became one, and their union had created something that would outlast them both. A family, a legacy, a story, and a reminder that the best things in life often come in unexpected packages, if only we are wise enough and brave enough and open enough to receive them.